thanks for the invite to come speak today.
I do want to thank you for the invite to come join you today. It is actually really, really humbling to be able to share ideas with some of the brilliant people that have been on the stage today, and to sit and talk with people that have been actually making the world better for decades, and then to talk to some of the young people that are going to make the world better for decades. It's really just humbling to be part of that. As Steve said, I work with International Justice Mission. I'm currently the Vice President of Global Strategy and Execution, which is the most non-descriptive title in the history of titles. I just took that job. I've been in the field for the last 8 years. I spent a year in Sri Lanka as our legal liaison to Sri Lanka. I spent 5 years in Uganda as our field office director there in Kampala, and then 2 years in the Philippines as our national director overseeing operations in Cebu, Manila, and Angeles City. For those of you who are not familiar with the work of International Justice Mission, I'm not sure where to point this. There we go. IJM, oh, thank you. IJM is a global human rights organization, and our mission is to protect the poor from violence. And we do that by working with local authorities to rescue individual victims, hold their abusers accountable through the criminal justice system, restore survivors to safety and strength, and ultimately to work with law enforcement to reform the public justice system so that it will create a safe future for those who, because of their poverty, actually live outside of the protection of the law. As Ashish said this morning in our opening general session, promoting peace is more than the absence of war and armed conflict. At IJM, we could not agree with that more. To truly bring about peace, we must address the everyday violence that plagues millions and millions of the world's poor today. Because the truth is, even in the absence of war and armed conflict, I'm not very good with this. Even in the absence of war and armed conflict, this widow is not experiencing peace when she is chased out of her land. I know that because I was standing right beside her when her attacker told her that he was going to lock her in her home with her children and burn it to the ground if she refused to leave. This young girl from Bolivia is not at peace when she drops out of school because she's afraid to walk to school because she's been repeatedly raped by someone in her neighborhood. She is not experiencing peace. And slaves in India who are tortured if they refuse to work. And I want to be really, really clear about this. Slavery still exists today. In fact, there are more slaves in the world today, that is in 2017, than there have been in any time in recorded human history. The best estimates are that there are somewhere between 45 and 46 million slaves in the world today. That is 20% more people than the population of the state of California. That is 4 times more slaves than were transported from Africa across the Atlantic over 400 years in the transatlantic slave trade. That's today, 2017. And when I say slavery, I'm not talking about some sort of metaphor for slavery or that people work in slave-like conditions or they don't get paid enough. I'm talking about, because I've seen it with my own eyes, the brutal one human owning another human form of slavery. Those slaves and those little girls and those widows, they do not experience peace because they experience violence. But the good news is that the world is learning how to lift the poor and the vulnerable out of the seemingly endless cycle of poverty and violence. At IJM, we firmly believe that the end of poverty, the end of poverty requires the end of violence. And the end of violence requires the end of impunity. I'm going to say that again. The end of violence requires the end of impunity. What I mean is, people need to replace impunity with accountability. And the way that they do that is through effective law enforcement. So if the end of poverty requires the end of violence, and the end of violence requires the end of impunity, and the end of impunity requires effective law enforcement, then in order to create peace, we need to invest in law enforcement. As we have developed our intervention model over the course of the last 2 decades, we have found that when law enforcement consistently holds violent offenders accountable for their crimes, the abuse of the poor and the vulnerable stops. We have also found that when the abuse of the poor and vulnerable stops, you actually find peace. And sometimes you find joy, even in places where you never thought it was possible. During my time in the Philippines, I saw some of the worst things that one human being can do to another human being. I sat in an investigator's car, monitoring an online chat where a man from the United States ordered the rape of a 1-year-old child in the same way that I would order Papa John's to make me a pizza. I saw girls pulled out of brothels. I saw girls pulled out of the street. In Uganda, I saw widows who'd been attacked with machetes and bludgeoned with bricks. I also saw some of the most joyful things I have ever experienced. In my very first day when I went to the Philippines, we went and visited a shelter that we partner with for survivors of sex trafficking. And the directors showed us around, and then the girls, they actually did a performance. If you've ever been to the Philippines, you can't go anywhere in the Philippines without a performance. And they did a little performance, and by the end of it, they had me up there dancing to Happy. And it was just so great to see these girls who were able to poke fun and laugh at a guy who looks like me, knowing that years before they had been abused and raped and exploited, probably by guys that looked a lot like me. And in my last year in the Philippines, I got to see some of what they were talking about, how faith-based organizations can actually get themselves involved. We were working with the Department of Social Welfare and Development to create a shelter, a processing center for victims. So we would extract young girls out of a brothel, and they needed somewhere to go where they could be cared for that first 24, 36, 48 hours. And the Department of Social Welfare didn't have a spot. They didn't have any land. And so there was an order of nuns. They called themselves the Holy Spirit Sisters. And they offered one of the buildings on their grounds to serve as that processing center. And during the first operation that they got to serve, we brought out about 21 girls. They ranged from about 13 to 19 years old. And the girls were scared, and they were tired, and they were angry. They were angry because their pimps had told them for years that if the police came, they would rape them or arrest them. And so they thought we were the enemy. And so they came in angry, and they came in agitated, and they came in not at all peaceful. And the next morning, we got to go to the building. And in the morning, we saw those nuns. And they were walking from bed to bed to bed. And they were delivering towels. And they were delivering bread. And they were delivering rice. And what we saw was peace in those young girls' lives in a way that it hadn't been there before. They almost melted as they began to rest in the peace that comes from the realization that these women were there to help them and not to harm them. And it was awesome. When law enforcement consistently holds violent offenders accountable for their crimes, the abuse stops. And when the abuse of the poor and the vulnerable stops, children like them are able to experience real peace. The way that I look at it is that the protection of the law is a lot like the protection of a vaccine. A vaccine has tremendous power to protect people from disease. You all are Rotarians. You know more about vaccines than pretty much anybody in the whole wide world. You know that a vaccine can save hundreds, thousands, and even millions of lives because you've seen it and you've done it yourselves. All right, quick disclaimer. You also know that some vaccines are taken orally and don't need a big scary needle like this. But it doesn't really help the analogy, so I'm going to go with it. A vaccine only works miracles if you can get it into the bloodstream of the person who needs it. A vaccine sitting in a laboratory, on a shipping dock, or in a warehouse like this does absolutely nothing to save a person's life. In fact, a man standing in a warehouse like this that's full of perfectly good vaccines is not protected at all if he lacks the needle that is needed to administer them. And ultimately, that man will still die of the disease that those vaccines were meant to protect him from. The same is true of the law. The law has tremendous power to protect the poor and the vulnerable from predators who would enslave, exploit, and abuse them. And when properly administered, the law has the power to save hundreds, thousands, and even millions of lives. But the law only works if it is actively enforced on behalf of the vulnerable. Just like that man standing in a warehouse without a needle will still die of disease, a slave standing in a law library full of treatises and laws and regulations will still die a slave if there is no law enforcement willing to bring her rescue and to hold her masters accountable. But what we know is that it doesn't have to be that way. History has shown us that if people and organizations of goodwill partner together, diseases of the body, like polio, can be eradicated from the face of the earth. You all are going to eradicate polio. It's going to be gone in the dustbin of history. And we believe that if people and organizations of goodwill partner together, diseases of society, like slavery, can be eradicated as well. You guys know this picture? In 1979, Rotary President James Bomar Jr. administered the first polio vaccine in the Philippines. That single act launched a project that protected thousands of vulnerable Filipinos from polio. And that project in the Philippines ultimately gave rise to the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. It was a partnership between Rotary and other organizations of goodwill, the Gates Foundation, the CDC, the World Health Organization, that over the course of 4 decades effectively wiped polio from the face of the earth. Interestingly enough, I believe that when history looks back on slavery, it's going to find that the end of slavery can also be traced back to a little project in the Philippines. In 2006, IJM partnered with the Gates Foundation to test our theory of change. What we wanted to do is we wanted to see if you could inject effective law enforcement into a system and cause a reduction in the prevalence of a particular type of abuse. In this case, reduce the prevalence of child sex trafficking in the city of Manila, or city of Cebu, where children were being openly bought and sold on the street for sex. The goal of the 4-year project was to realize a 20% reduction in the availability of children for commercial sex in that city. 1 in 5. And so, with generous support from the Gates Foundation, for the next 4 years, we administered the vaccine. Partnering with local law enforcement like these people, police officers, prosecutors, social workers, we engaged in collaborative casework. We rescued individual victims, extracting them from brothels, bars, and massage parlors. We brought individual criminals to justice through criminal prosecution. And we restored individual survivors to safety and strength. And we partnered with the government to stand up new law enforcement capacities that were informed by that casework, a specialized trafficking investigation unit, an anti-trafficking prosecutorial task force, a specialized victim recovery center like the one I talked to you about earlier. They were all designed to bring rescue to hundreds and hundreds of children. And more importantly, they created a deterrent impact that ensured the safe and sustainable future for thousands of other young Filipino children who would never, ever, ever have to experience the horror of being bought and sold for sex. We did not rescue them all. We did not arrest them all. What we did is we actually changed the environment. We introduced risk to those who would abuse and took away profit from those who would profit from it. And they began to stop. Just like in the Philippines in 1979, the vaccine began to take. And we began to see a radical reduction in the prevalence of child sex trafficking. In 2010, 4 years later, an independent auditor found that the availability of children for commercial sex in Metro Cebu had dropped not by 20%, but by 79%. This morning, I can't remember who it was, but they were talking about a communication in the 1980s where they said, the vaccine has a 90% success rate. Well, we're not quite at 90%, but we're getting close. And we recognized that this model was working, and so we started to replicate that model all around the world, bringing freedom to slaves in India, Thailand, and Ghana, hope for sexual assault victims in Guatemala, Thailand, and Bolivia, bringing safety to widows and orphans and the poor across East Africa, and bringing rescue to children from sex slavery and online sexual exploitation all around the world. Another thing that IJM did was they sent me to the Philippines. I can take no responsibility for the statistics I just showed you. But then they sent me and said, we want you to replicate it in 2 more cities. And so we did. We did it in Manila, and we did it in Angeles City. And again, we administered the vaccine. And just like we had done in Cebu, we injected effective law enforcement into an environment of absolute impunity. And just like what happened in Cebu, the prevalence of child sex trafficking dropped through the floor. Just this year, we conducted end-line studies, and we found a 75% reduction in the availability of children for commercial sex in Manila, a city of 12 million people, and an 86% reduction in the availability of children for commercial sex in Angeles City, which holds one of the most notorious sexual tourism locations in all of the world. When we got there in Angeles City, 1 in 11 sex workers was a minor. 4 years later, that ratio had dropped to 1 in 83. Our vision at IJM over the course of the last 10 years has been to rescue thousands, protect millions, and prove that justice for the poor is possible. And over the course of the last 10 years, we have rescued 33,000 individuals. We have protected over 3 million people from violent abuse. And we have proven in city after city and country after country that justice is possible. And now, as we look to the future, we want to partner with others of goodwill, others like you, to create a global movement that will make justice for the poor unstoppable. And right now, we believe that it is a time in history where that is actually possible. In December of last year, President Obama signed legislation creating the End Modern Slavery Initiative. It was introduced by Senator Bob Corker, and it was intended to create a $1.5 billion fund that will break the back of modern-day slavery by funding programs to rescue enslaved men, women, and children and bring their abusers to justice. Much like the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, it's an initiative of people of goodwill to administer a vaccine. And much like was the case in the 1980s, Rotary has been leading the charge. In India, Rotary is partnering with IJM to serve slaves who have been freed. In the Philippines, Rotary was partnering with my team to create aftercare places for them to go. And here in the United States, countless Rotarians pressured the government to fund the End Modern Slavery Initiative. On behalf of IJM and the thousands of slaves who have been freed and will be freed, I'd like to thank you all for your support and for your partnership. At the same time, I don't think that's actually enough. I'd like you all to also press further into this fight. As Rotarians, you are a unique force in this world. You represent a global network that has a history of tackling the world's most pressing humanitarian challenges. 40 years ago, millions were dying from polio. There was a perfectly good vaccine to prevent it, but the poor and vulnerable lacked access, and the rest of the world lacked information. Until you stepped in. Rotary sounded the alarm. Rotary rallied over $1 billion in resources. Rotary built the movement. And because of that, polio is going to end. 40 years from now, I am hopeful that someone is going to say the same thing about slavery. They'll say that back in 2017, slavery was against the law everywhere in the world, but the laws just weren't being enforced. We had a vaccine to end it, but the poor didn't have access to it, and the rest of the world didn't know about it. And then there was a movement, and that all changed. And because of that movement, our children will be the first generation in human history to live in a world without slavery. If you all are interested in making this a reality, I'd invite you to visit our website. It's www.ijm.org/Rotary. And it will give you concrete steps that you can take to fight slavery around the world and here in the United States. To truly bring about peace, we have to address everyday violence. There is a vaccine. We just need to get it into the bloodstream of those who need it. Thank you.